In 2020, a man of 73, working from a house on a quiet street in a suburb west of Munich, published a book that was not his. It was the last chapter of somebody else's history of the world, a chapter missing for 80 years since the author stopped writing. He had spent 4 decades editing that author. He had put out the collected essays, the readers, the selections, one volume after another since the 1980s. Then, at the end of all that, he found the ending that was not there, set it in type, sent it out. I want you to hold that picture, because we are going to come back to it at the very end of the night, and it will mean something different then. The man's name is Heribert Illig. He is not a historian and has never claimed to be. And he is the reason that, if you go looking, you can find perfectly sincere people who will tell you that the year is not what you think it is, that 300 years of history never happened at all. Come in, friends. The hour is late, and nothing here is due. Let the day set itself down somewhere. It can find its own way home. Tonight is a claim that 300 years of history never happened, that the years between 614 and 911 are empty, that the man we call Charlemagne is largely a fiction, that we are all living in a year with the wrong number on it. It is one of the strangest things anyone has ever argued in print, argued carefully by people who meant it. And there is a single clause in a document from 1582 that settles the whole thing. One subordinate line in Latin, written by men who were not thinking about any of this, who had no idea what they were settling. I am going to save it until we have earned it. We will do what the record does. Take the claim at its full strength first, the way its makers actually made it, and then let the evidence answer, piece by piece, from the trees and the ice and a sky nobody has ever been able to edit. I will say now that the claim does not survive. That is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what is left standing after it falls, because some of what these men said was perfectly true. One of the things they asked for, they eventually got. If you drift before the answer arrives, no harm done. The question is 1200 years old and in no particular hurry. But first, the claim itself. And it starts with a mistake of 11 minutes. Everything tonight rests on a small error made by Julius Caesar, or rather by the astronomers he hired. By the historian's account, the Roman calendar had drifted into chaos, and in the middle of the 1st century before Christ, it was put right. A year of 365 days, with an extra day every 4th year to soak up the remainder. 365 and a quarter days. It is an elegant fix, and it held for 16 centuries, but the actual year, the time it takes the Earth to come back round to the same place against the Sun, is not 365 and a quarter days. It is a little less. Not much, about 11 minutes and 14 seconds less. 11 minutes is nothing. 11 minutes is the difference between a clock that is right and a clock nobody would bother to fix. But a calendar does not forget. It adds those 11 minutes to itself every year, forever. And 11 minutes a year comes to a whole day every 128 years. Now, the reason anyone noticed. Easter is not a fixed date. It is calculated, the calculation starting from the spring equinox, the day in March when light and dark come out even. The church had fixed that equinox on the calendar at the 21st of March, and every year the whole moving architecture of the Christian calendar was built outward from that one peg. So picture what a slow drift does to that. The calendar says the 21st of March. The sky says the equinox came days ago, and the gap widens silently, a day at a time, across lifetimes. Nobody alive long enough to see it move. By the time anyone did something about it, in the 1500s, the calendar and the sky were 10 days apart. 10 days of accumulated 11-minute errors sitting there in plain view. That is the machinery. A calendar that runs slow, a church that needed it not to, and a discrepancy anybody with an instrument could measure. Hold on to the number 10. That 10 is where this entire story begins, and where a man in Munich, 400 years later, thought he had caught the human race in the largest lie it has ever told. The theory was born at a table. May of 1990, in Vienna. 4 men, a bottle of the local white wine, an argument about chronology that had been running by post for years. By the account the movement itself gives, the shape of the thing got sketched out that evening. A phone call in August put the word to it. In German, the word is Phantomzeit, phantom time. One of them described it as an amputated limb, a stretch of years the body still feels, but which is not there. Here is the arithmetic that convinced them. I want to give it at full strength because it is not stupid, and pretending it is would waste your evening. The calendar loses a day every 128 years. When Pope Gregory's commission corrected the drift in 1582, they took out 10 days. So, the reasoning goes, count backwards. 10 days of drift, at a day per 128 years, is about 1,257 years of accumulated error. Subtract that from 1582, and you land in the year 325. But the calendar was not set in 325. It was set by Caesar in the 1st century before Christ. So by that reckoning, the commission should have found not 10 days of error, but 13. They found 10. 3 days are missing. And 3 days of drift at a day per 128 years is about 300 years. So, slowly, in case any of that slid past, the reform took out 10 days. The theory says it should have taken out 13. 3 days unaccounted for, and 3 days is 3 centuries. That is the whole argument, and everything else tonight is an answer to it. That, as the theory has it, is the whole engine. From it, the theory reads off everything else. 297 years of history that were never lived, running from the summer of 614 to the autumn of 911. Delete them, and out goes most of what we call the Carolingian age, including the figure the movement's own website calls the Lighthouse of Europe, Charlemagne himself. Then the supporting arguments, which are the ones its defenders say give the theory its emotional force. Look at those centuries, they said, and see how little is there. Few buildings you can date with confidence, long silences in the written record, styles of architecture that seem to pick up on the far side of the gap, almost where they left off on the near side, as though nothing much had happened in between. Whole regions where the archaeology thins to almost nothing and then resumes. And who would do such a thing? The theory names 3: a Byzantine emperor, a young German emperor crowned as a child, and the learned pope who tutored him. Men who, on this reading, wanted to be standing at the year 1000 rather than somewhere in the 700s, and had the reach to move the count. I have now given you the version you will find if you go looking in English, and I have to tell you that the men who built this did not all believe that last part. One of them wrote the movement's founding paper in English, raised exactly that answer: the secret societies, the church, the conspiracy, then threw it away in print. That answer, he wrote, is not only far too simple, it is essentially wrong. The conspiracy is the shape the story took in translation. What the original was, underneath, was something much more sympathetic. A small group of clever outsiders looking at a genuinely thin stretch of the past and asking who had ever actually checked. To understand why that question felt so open to them, you have to know how the years got their numbers in the first place. It is stranger than you would guess. Nobody in the ancient world, so far as the record shows, counted the years the way we do. A Roman did not live in a numbered year of the world. He lived in the year of two named consuls, or in the 15th year of an emperor, or in a tax cycle that came round every 15 years. Dates were local, official, and tied to whoever happened to be in charge. If you wanted to know how long ago something was, you counted back through a list of names. Counting from the birth of Christ was invented, and the record names roughly who invented it. In the early 500s, a monk in Rome, working on the perennial problem of when Easter falls, needed a way to lay out his tables and chose to number the years from the Incarnation. He is known as Dionysius Exiguus, which means Dionysius the Small, apparently his own joke about himself. He did the arithmetic, produced his tables. The idea then sat there for 2 centuries doing very little. What made it standard was a book. In the 700s, in a monastery in the north of England, the scholar we call Bede wrote a treatise on the reckoning of time, using that count throughout. And Bede was read everywhere, for centuries, by everyone who mattered to this question. The years got their numbers because one careful monk in Northumbria wrote the textbook. Now sit with what that means, because this is the honest strangeness the whole theory feeds on, and I would rather hand it to you plainly than have you feel it as a trick later. The count we all live inside is a medieval scholarly construction. It was assembled by hand, by men working from lists, several centuries after the events at the front of it. It is not a chain of receipts running back to the beginning. It is a piece of intellectual carpentry, and like all carpentry, it was made by somebody at a particular bench for a particular purpose. That is entirely true. It is uncontroversial among historians, and it is not remotely the same thing as saying the count is wrong. A tape measure is also a human invention. It still measures, but you can see, can you not, how a person of a certain temperament looks at that and feels a floor move. If the numbering was built by hand, if the men who built it were working from patchy lists in an age that we know produced forged documents by the hundred, then who checked? Who ever went back and confirmed, independently, that the joints hold? Who checked, and when? For a long time, nobody knew. That question is the good part of this story. It is the part that turns out decades later to have an answer nobody expected. But we are not there yet, because first there is the matter of who was asking, and they were not professors. There were about 50 of them, and they met in rented rooms. According to its own internal history, the society that produced this was founded in Munster in 1982, and its purpose, in the German of its own name, was the reconstruction of human and natural history. Its founder was a Swiss systems analyst named Christoph Marx, who had spent years bringing an American writer's catastrophe theories to German readers, who had once travelled to the United States to secure the German rights to one of those books from the author himself, a year before the man died. The society began, by its own internal history, with barely a dozen members. 5 years in, it had 48, of whom 18 turned up to the annual meeting. It published a bulletin that was photocopied and posted. Its treasurer died in 1986. His widow took over the accounts. Heribert Illig was its managing director, an officer of the society, not its founder. And here is a detail from that same internal history that tells you the whole texture of the thing. The founder, Marx, held no office at all in the organization he had started, and the correspondence kept going to Basel rather than to the man actually running it. Now the other half of Illig's life, which matters more than any of this. By training, he is a Germanist, a scholar of German language and literature. For 40 years, his real work, the work he has never stopped doing, has been editing a Viennese writer named Egon Friedel, a cabaret performer and cultural historian who wrote history as literature, brilliantly and unacademically, in the 1920s and 30s. Friedel was lost in the spring of 1938 when the world went wrong in Vienna, and he did not finish what he was writing. Illig published the essays in 87, The Reader in 88, another collection in 89, more in 2009, and in 2020, at 73, the missing final chapter. That is the man, a devoted editor of somebody else's unfinished book, who went looking, in his other life, for a missing chapter in the history of the world. His own press is a house in a Munich suburb. The address is printed in the front of the books, with a residential phone number under it. And out of that address, in 1996, a mainstream Düsseldorf publisher took his argument and sold it as a mass-market paperback. 431 pages, maps and illustrations, called The Invented Middle Ages. It sold, and it kept selling, and it is why anybody outside a photocopied bulletin has ever heard of any of this. What had convinced him that documents could lie on that scale was not a fantasy. It was a conference, a real one, run by real medievalists about something that really happened. In September of 1986, in Munich, medieval historians held a congress about forgery in the Middle Ages. Not a fringe event, the German state's own historical institute, the scholars who edit the medieval sources for a living, a Bavarian minister opening the proceedings. Days of papers on fabricated charters and invented letters, and the long scholarly labour of telling the true from the false. Illig went by his own account, and the thing he took away from it by his own account was not a fact, but a permission. If the professionals themselves spend their careers separating genuine documents from manufactured ones, if the manufacturing was that widespread, then how far does it go? Where does the checking stop? He was not imagining the problem. This is the part where I have to be scrupulously fair to him, because the forgeries are real, they are enormous, they sit exactly where he was looking. In the 9th century, somewhere in northern France, the scholarship points to the monastery at Corbie, somebody manufactured a library. Not one document, a whole corpus of them. Nearly 100 letters attributed to popes who had been dead for centuries, written in their names on matters of church law, woven together with genuine material so skillfully that the collection was used as authentic for the next 700 years. It is one of the largest forgeries in European history. It was exposed not by outsiders, but by historians, working slowly from the inside. Who exactly did it, and precisely when and why, is still argued over in the journals today. A scholar in the 2000s overturned a good deal of the previous consensus, while another has been contesting the revision ever since. So consider the man sitting in that hall, not a historian, a literary editor with a taste for unorthodox arguments, listening to the world's leading medievalists explain in detail that the 9th century produced 100 forged papal letters which fooled Europe for 7 centuries. The question that formed in him is a reasonable question. If they could fake the documents, could they fake the calendar? The answer is no, and the reason is that a calendar is not a document. A document is a piece of parchment that says a thing. A calendar is a claim about the sky, and the sky can be checked. Which brings us, at last, to the clause I have been saving. The whole theory rests on a single number, the 10 days that Pope Gregory's commission removed from October of 1582. The argument is that 10 days is 3 days short of what 16 centuries of drift should have produced, and that the shortfall is the fingerprint of 3 missing centuries. There is no record of anyone in the movement doing the obvious thing first. So here it is, and it is remarkable how rarely it gets done. Read the document. The bull is called Inter Gravissimus, from its opening words, and it was issued in February of 1582. It is not a long text. It sets out the problem. It sets out the fix. It explains what is being corrected. In the middle of a sentence about restoring the spring equinox to its proper place, it says what it is measuring from. The Latin is Aqua iam a concilio niceno decem circiter diebus recessit. In English, from which it has already receded by about 10 days since the Council of Nicaea. Since the Council of Nicaea, not since Julius Caesar. Nicaea is the great church council of the year 325, the one that fixed the rules the Christian calendar runs on, the one that pegged the equinox at the 21st of March in the first place. And that is the entire theory, undone by its own foundation document in a subordinate clause. The Commission was never trying to undo 16 centuries of drift. It was restoring the equinox to where the Church had set it in 325. 1,257 years of drift at a day per 128 years gives you very close to 10 days. They removed 10 days. The arithmetic is not short by 3. It was never a subtraction from Caesar. The 3 missing days are missing from a calculation nobody in Rome was performing. The bull says so twice, in fact. When it gives the operative order, take out 10 days, let the day after the 4th of October be called the 15th, it names Nicaea again as the thing being restored to. There is a second problem, quieter and just as fatal, and I will take it slowly. The reform corrected the moon as well as the sun, where the lunar error runs on a different clock. It accumulates far more slowly. The bull gives that discrepancy too, 4 days and more. So there are 2 errors on 2 different clocks, and any theory that deletes centuries has to make both come out right, in different proportions, at the same time. A German scholar put that objection to Illig in the 1990s. Illig's response was to say his figure could be adjusted, perhaps to 304 years instead of 297, which is a revealing move. A number that can be tuned to fit is not a measurement. So the case is closed on the document alone. But I'm not going to leave it there, because the document is only the tidiest answer. The beautiful answers are the ones that come from people who had never heard of any of this, starting with a friar with an instrument, 300 years before the bull. In 1267, an English friar named Roger Bacon wrote to the Pope about the calendar, and he was not guessing. The record says Bacon is one of those medieval figures who has been dressed up in so much later legend that it is easy to forget he was primarily a man who liked measuring things. What he sent to Rome was a complaint with numbers in it. The calendar, he said, was wrong, and he could say by how much. The equinox in his own day was falling around the 13th of March, not the 21st. 8 days adrift. He gave the rate at which the error accumulated, roughly a day in 130 years, which is very nearly the true figure. He even projected forward, naming the years in the next century when the drift would reach the next whole day. Sit with what that is. A man in the 13th century, with instruments a modern astronomer would call crude, measuring an 11-minute-a-year error by watching the sun, getting it right. Now put that beside the theory, because this is where the trouble is. Bacon measured 8 days of drift in 1267. The Commission measured 10 days of drift in 1582. Between those two dates, there are 315 years. And 315 years at a day per 128 produces very close to 2.5 more days. 8 days of drift, then 10 days of drift, with 315 ordinary years in between. And the difference between 8 and 10 is exactly what 315 years of an 11-minute error produces. That is a measurement taken by a man who could not have known what it would later be asked to prove, checked against another measurement taken 3 centuries after him by people with no interest in the question either. Neither was thinking about the 7th century. Both were thinking about Easter. Between them, they demonstrate that the years from the 1200s to the 1500s ran at the ordinary rate, one after another, with nothing removed. To break that, you would have to suppose that Bacon's number was fabricated too, and that whoever fabricated it was clever enough to make it consistent with a reform 300 years in his future. At which point the theory has stopped being a theory about history and become a theory about magic. And the calendar kept being corrected, in public, by people who hated the authority that had corrected it first. That is worth a moment, because it is quietly one of the best pieces of evidence in the whole story. The record is plain that Protestant Europe did not want the Pope's calendar. That is putting it mildly. For a century and a half, a good deal of the continent kept the old reckoning, largely because the correction had come from Rome. So dates in diplomatic letters had to be written twice. England held out until 1752, and when Parliament finally gave in, it faced an arithmetic problem that is, for our purposes tonight, perfect. The gap had gone on widening the whole time it was ignored. Gregory's people took out 10 days in 1582. England, 170 years later, had to take out 11. One more day. Which is exactly what 170 years of 11-minute errors produces. Then Russia, which held out longer still, into the 20th century. When the Bolsheviks changed the calendar by decree in 1918, the gap had reached 13 days. And 13 is precisely where the arithmetic says it should have been by then. Look at what that sequence is. 10 days, removed by a Catholic commission in 1582. 11 days, removed by a Protestant parliament in 1752, which had every political reason to want the Roman calculation to be wrong, and could find nothing wrong with it. 13 days, removed by revolutionary atheists in 1918, who had no reason on earth to protect a papal number. 3 corrections, 3 centuries apart, made by parties who agreed on nothing else, each one landing exactly where an unbroken run of years requires. If 300 years had been inserted somewhere in the 700s, every one of those numbers would be wrong. They would be wrong by different amounts, and somebody in Westminster or Petrograd would have noticed the discrepancy with enormous pleasure. Nobody noticed, because there was nothing to notice. That is the calendar answering for itself from 3 directions. But the calendar is a European instrument, and a determined theorist could always tell a story about Europe. So now let us leave Europe entirely and go to an office in China, where men were writing down the sky every night, and where nobody had ever heard of Charlemagne or cared what year the Franks thought it was. In the Chinese capital, the histories record, there was an observatory, and it was not a private tower belonging to an enthusiast. It was a government bureau, housed inside the imperial palace or right beside it, staffed by trained officials whose job was to watch the sky and file what they saw. Eclipses, comets, new stars, spots on the sun, strange lights in the north. Every entry dated by the emperor's reign era, by the lunar month, by a day name from a 60-day cycle that had been turning without interruption for many centuries, and often by the sun's position against a named division of the sky. Astronomers who work with these records today rate them highly for a specific reason. Trained observers at known locations filing regularly, the date and the details written down together. That is not a chronicle composed later from memory. It is a logbook. And here is the sentence from the modern study that I keep coming back to. Because of the political importance of these observations, it says, they were made even during wars. Which is not an abstraction. In the middle of the 8th century, the Tang Empire came apart in a rebellion that is remembered as the worst civil war of the dynasty. 8 years of it, the capital taken, the court in flight. Through all of it, the observations kept being filed. The bureau kept working while the state around it was breaking. Now take one night out of that logbook, because it does more work than any argument I could make. The 5th of August, 761. 2 years after the worst of the fighting. The entry records a solar eclipse, total, it says, with all the bright stars appearing, and it fixes the event 4 separate ways at once. The 2nd year of a named reign era, the 1st day of the 7th lunar month, which is to say a new moon, a day name from the 60-day cycle that had been turning without a break for centuries, and the sun standing at a named division of the sky. 4 coordinates, and every one of them can be checked today. Modern astronomers have back-computed that eclipse. The moon's shadow was where it should have been, over that city, on that day, to a magnitude of essentially total. The reign era, the lunar phase, the cycle day and the sky position all agree, with each other and with the calculation. And that is one night. There are runs of these entries stretching end to end across the whole disputed window, the 6th century, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, hundreds of solar eclipse records in the dynastic histories, most of them corresponding to real eclipses that the mathematics confirms. Here is my favorite detail in the entire episode, and it is a detail about being wrong. Not all of those records check out. Some entries describe eclipses that the computation says were not visible from the capital at all. One of them, in 879, records a total eclipse on a day when the moon's shadow missed the earth entirely, a prediction that got written down as though it had been seen. That is the signature of a real institution. Working bureaus produce errors and predictions that did not come off, and clerks filing what the tables said rather than walking outside. A forger inventing 3 centuries of records would produce something much tidier than this. The mess is the proof. And it is not only China. The same centuries are covered continuously and independently by other people entirely. Here is the principle in plain words. Astronomers will tell you it is the reason this argument ends. The solar system runs on physics. The moon goes round the Earth goes round the sun. A comet on a long orbit comes back when its orbit brings it back. All of that can be computed forwards, all of it can be computed backwards. An astronomer today can say where every shadow fell on a given afternoon 1100 years ago and be confident about it. So an eclipse recorded in a chronicle is not testimony, it is a measurement, taken by somebody who could not have faked it, of a machine nobody can adjust. And when the chronicle's date and the computation's date agree, when the shadow is where the record says, on the day the record says, seen from the city the record says, that is a year being confirmed by the solar system. And the confirmation is unforgiving in a way worth understanding, because it involves the Earth's own slowing. The Earth is not a perfect clock. Tides drag on it. Its rotation has gradually slowed, so that time measured by the turning Earth has drifted away from time measured by the orbits. Astronomers carry that difference as a correction. Across these centuries it is large, thousands of seconds. Now here is why that matters. The Earth turns 15 degrees in an hour, so an error of an hour in that correction moves the eclipse track 15 degrees around the planet. Hundreds of miles of shadow, easily enough to take the eclipse off the city that reported it. Which means the date and the place are welded together. Nobody can slide a record 300 years and have the shadow still fall on the observer. Move the date, and the eclipse happens somewhere else entirely. Then the comets, which are the loveliest version of the same point. Halley's comet comes back roughly every 75 or 76 years, and it came back inside the supposedly empty window, and it was seen and written down. Those apparitions were logged by court astronomers who described what they saw, the direction, the length of the tail, the days it remained. Compute the orbit backwards. The returns land where the records put them. A comet does not care what year a European monk thinks it is. It arrives on its own schedule, was seen by people with no connection to each other, each sighting a nail driven through the chronology at a fixed point. And the sun left one more mark, in a place nobody thought to look until quite recently, not in any archive, but inside living wood. A tree in a temperate climate puts on one ring a year. That is the whole basis of the method, and nobody disputes it. Wide in a good year, narrow in a hard one, so a length of timber carries a barcode of good and bad seasons, where two pieces of wood overlapping in time carry the same stretch of pattern. That is the whole method. Match the pattern in a living tree to the pattern in an old beam. Match that beam to a beam still older. Then walk backwards, overlap by overlap, into the past. Picture the bench where it happens. A core sample the width of a pencil laid out under a lamp, the rings counted with a hand lens, a technician sliding one sequence against another to find the place where the peaks and troughs line up. Do that patiently enough, with enough oak, and you get a continuous ring-by-ring chronology reaching thousands of years back, and it runs straight through the disputed centuries without a seam. Now the honest part, because one of these men made a fair criticism here and deserves credit for it. Hans Ulrich Niemitz, who wrote the movement's English paper, complained that at certain joins the chronology rested on very few pieces of wood. 3 oaks here, 4 oaks there. That was a real objection. He wrote in 1995 that the chronology of the early Middle Ages had never been independently validated, that he could not get anyone to check. Hold that sentence. It comes back in a few minutes, and it is the best thing in this story. Because in 2012, a Japanese research group found something that nobody had been looking for. They were measuring radiocarbon in tree rings year by year, and in the rings for 774 and 775, they found a spike, a sharp jump in the amount of radioactive carbon laid down in a single year. Something had flooded the upper atmosphere with radiation. The best explanation on offer, the researchers say, is an enormous storm on the Sun, far beyond anything in the modern instrumental record. And here is what that spike is good for. It is a stamp, a single year marked worldwide in a medium that counts itself one ring at a time. It has since been confirmed in trees on several continents, in coral from the South China Sea, and in an Antarctic ice core, where it appears in a layer of ice laid down that same year. There is a second one, in 993. Both of them fall inside or beside the window the theory wants to delete. Think about what that means for the claim. In the summer of 774, on this theory, nobody was alive because the year did not exist. And yet trees in Japan and in Germany and in North America all wrote the same mark in the same ring. And the ice at the bottom of the world wrote it too. Every one of those records counting backwards to the same year independently, all of them agreeing. Nothing can forge that. Nothing can even bribe it. It is a physical event, recorded by physical processes in half a dozen unrelated archives on opposite sides of the planet. And while all this was accumulating, the question of what was actually standing in Europe during those centuries had its own answer, one that is less dramatic than the trees and more human. The theory's most persuasive move was never the arithmetic. It was the feeling that those centuries are oddly empty, that a person can walk through a museum and find the cases thin, that not much seems to survive. So what does survive? There is a chapel at Aachen in western Germany, built for Charlemagne, an octagon of stone and arches that has been standing, roofed and used for 1,200 years. It is not a ruin somebody dug up. It has been continuously in service, its fabric examined by the ordinary methods, the stonework, the mortar, the timbers, the coins found under floors. There is the handwriting. In those same decades, the script of Western Europe changed, a deliberate reform, a clear, round letter form designed to be legible and copyable, spreading from a handful of monastic workshops out across the continent. Scholars can date a manuscript from its letter forms the way you might date a photograph from a car in the background, and the new hand appears where the standard chronology says it should, then spreads outward at the speed writing habits spread. There are the coins, in hordes, in sequences, one ruler's silver lying above another's in the ground. And there is the paperwork of ordinary life, land grants, monastery inventories, letters about grain, the unglamorous documents that survive precisely because nobody thought they mattered enough to destroy. Now the honest half, which the episode owes you. Those centuries genuinely are thin, and the thinness is not imaginary. Far fewer documents survive than from the periods on either side, fewer buildings, long silences in some regions where there is no evidence at all for years at a stretch. That is real, and any historian will say so, but the reason is mundane and rather sad. Parchment is animal skin. It rots. It gets scraped clean and written over when material is scarce. Monasteries burned repeatedly. Wooden buildings do not last, and most buildings were wooden. Record-keeping in the West collapsed with the Roman administration that had required it and took centuries to rebuild. What sits in those thin cases is not an edit. It is attrition. the ordinary loss of things nobody was trying to preserve for anybody. The old name for those centuries was the Dark Ages, and historians have been steadily abandoning that phrase because the darkness was mostly in our own view of them rather than in the period itself. The light is dim because the lamp is far away, not because the room was empty. That is the honest kernel underneath the whole theory, and I think it deserves respect. Somebody looked at a genuinely poor stretch of the record and felt the poverty as suspicious. That instinct was wrong here. It is not a foolish instinct. And the man who felt it most rigorously asked for something specific and got it, eventually, from people who had never heard of him. Remember what Niemitz wrote in 1995, that the chronology of the early Middle Ages had never been independently validated, that at the joins it rested on a handful of pieces of wood, that he was a professor of the history of technology, and he could not get anybody to go and check. He was wrong about the conclusion, as the evidence has shown. He was not being unreasonable about the demand. According to his own paper, he had asked repeatedly and got nowhere. Validation is a real thing to want, and the specialists are confident is not the same as somebody outside the specialty has confirmed it. Now come forward 23 years. In 2018, a large international group of scientists, dozens of them across many institutions, published a paper on the tree ring record. And the paper opens by conceding, in its own words, that tree ring dating had never been independently validated at the global scale. The same sentence, written by the field about itself. And then they validated it. They used the storm, the radiocarbon spike from the sun in 774, as an absolute marker, then went looking for it in tree ring sequences all over the world. Hundreds of ring measurements from 5 continents, from chronologies built independently by different laboratories using different species of tree in different climates. The mark appears in all of them, in the same ring. That is the validation Niemitz said had never been done. It was done for its own reasons, by people pursuing a solar physics question. I want to be exact here. Nobody did it because of Illig. This is not a story where the outsiders forced the establishment's hand. The demand and the answer arrived independently, decades apart. But the demand was the same demand. And the answer, when it came from outside the discipline being doubted, from physicists and chemists and ice core specialists, using a mark left by the sun on a question about medieval chronology, which is precisely the kind of check he said would be needed. By that test, the chronology passed. It passed the way you would want it to pass, not by authority, not by consensus, but by a physical event recorded on 5 continents in a year the theory says did not happen. The movement itself wound down. Its founder died in Basel in 2016. Niemitz died in 2010. Illig kept publishing out of the same house, and in one of the more disarming things I found while preparing this, he has described his own number, the 297 years, as a fossil. A working hypothesis he has called a working hypothesis until he is tired of saying it. Does it have any value beyond that? He asked. He put the question himself in print and left it open, which is where I would like to leave it too. So let the two endings stand side by side at their honest equal weight and take whichever one you like into sleep. In the first, the arithmetic closed a long time ago, and the rest is grief for a thin century. The document says what it corrected, and it names a church council in the year 325. A friar measured the sky in 1267 getting the number only unbroken years can give. Parliament skipped 11 days, and a revolutionary decree skipped 13, both exactly on schedule. A government office in China filed the sky through a civil war, and one night's entry in 761 still checks out 4 different ways. Somewhere in a tree in Japan and in ice at the bottom of the world, there is a mark the sun left in the summer of 774, a year that on this theory nobody lived through. What is real is the thinness, a stretch of centuries from which too little survives, in which men truly did write false letters in dead popes' names, about which we will always know less than we would like. The theory is what that shortage feels like from the inside, and in the second, they were wrong about the years, and right that somebody ought to check. A man wrote in 1995 that the chronology had never been independently validated and that nobody would go and look. 23 years later, a paper opened with that same concession, then did the looking, with hundreds of tree rings from 5 continents against a storm on the sun. Nobody did it for him, but the demand was his demand, and the answer came from outside the discipline being doubted, exactly what he had said it would take. He asked, in print, whether his own idea had any value beyond being a working hypothesis, and did not answer himself. The record holds both of those comfortably. It is in no hurry to decide, and neither are we. And now back to the desk in the Munich suburb, because I promised you we would return. Think about what Heribert Illig actually did, twice, with the same pair of hands. In one life he spent 40 years with the unfinished work of a Viennese writer who never got to finish it. Then, at 73, produced the missing final chapter and sent it into the world. In the other life, he looked at the history of Europe, became convinced that a chapter was missing there too, and spent 30 years trying to supply it. The same instinct pointed at 2 different books. In one case, the chapter was really there. There is nothing to laugh at in that. A person who cannot bear an unfinished thing is not a fool. That impulse has produced a great deal of what we have. It simply happens that the past is not a book with a missing chapter. It is a room with a dim lamp, and the answer to a dim lamp is not to decide the room was never built. The years being counted around this house tonight are real ones, counted and checked and confirmed by trees, by ice, by eclipses and comets, by clerks in Chang'an and monks in Northumbria who never met nor agreed on anything else. Nobody removed any of them. Nobody could have. 1,200 years ago, somewhere under the same sky, the sun threw a storm, and a tree wrote it down without knowing. It is still there in the wood. Sleep well, friends. The count is safe, and so is the night. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review, if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet and let yourself rest. I will be here